As you know, they've announced a few days ago that they're going to move a lot of their manufacturing business to Mexico. I just noticed behind me John Deere tractors. I know a lot about John Deere. I love the company, but
It started with what appeared to be routine inspections. Mexican customs officials at the Laredo and Nogales border crossings announced what they called enhanced agricultural equipment inspection protocols. On paper, it looked like standard bureaucracy, but in practice, it was anything but routine. Over 140 John Deere tractors and harvesting machines were abruptly held at the border, left to idle under the scorching sun, baking in rows as far as the eye could see. This wasn't just red tape, it was a precision strike. While John Deere machinery was being blocked, rival brands like Case IH and Kubota crossed the same checkpoints with minimal or no delay. The timing wasn't coincidental either. The move came just weeks before Mexico's critical spring planting season. With tens of thousands of acres in northern Mexican states waiting for fertilization, tilling, and seeding, the halt of this equipment was devastating. For many farmers who had already prepaid for their machinery, this wasn't just a logistical delay, it was an existential crisis. Real quick, if you're into videos that cut through the noise and break things down clearly, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps more people find this. And if you're not subscribed yet, now's a good time. We've got more deep dives coming your way. Also, drop a comment and let me know what you think. I'd love to hear your take. Now on to the video. Farmers on both sides of the border were blindsided. On the U.S. side, Deere's logistics team scrambled for answers. Their inquiries were met with vague responses citing compliance issues, safety regulations, and national standards. But beneath the diplomatic phrasing was a clearer, more aggressive message. John Deere was no longer welcome in Mexico without consequences. This disruption came at the worst possible moment. For Deere, whose presence in Mexico represents over $1 billion in annual equipment sales and $2 billion in service and parts revenue, this was more than an inconvenience. It was a financial and reputational disaster. On the Mexican side, the sudden stop sent shockwaves across an agricultural industry already under pressure. Farmers, who had trusted Deere's branding and paid top dollar for its promise of reliability, found themselves abandoned in a border purgatory. The blockade marked the climax of a tension that had been building silently for over a decade. At the center of it all was a fundamental clash. The right of farmers to control and repair the tools they depend on versus a corporate model built around tight control, proprietary software, and limited repair access. Behind closed doors, Mexican trade officials were anything but silent. Internal government documents later leaked to journalists revealed a long-standing frustration with Deere's practices. The government had studied the agricultural giant's dependence on Mexican manufacturing and its exploitative repair model. They chose their moment carefully. When the inspections were launched, it was with maximum tactical and symbolic impact, and the message was loud and clear. The era of unchecked corporate dominance in the agricultural sector was over. But this wasn't just about blocked tractors. It was the opening salvo in a broader confrontation, one that would shake the foundations of modern agriculture, fuel political tension, and trigger a wave of rebellion among farmers across the continent. As Deere's management team worked furiously to secure diplomatic back channels and reinstate the flow of machinery, they underestimated the deeper currents that were shifting. This wasn't just about shipping delays. It was about power, control, and a reckoning decades in the making. Mexico had fired the first shot in what would soon be understood not as a trade dispute, but as a grassroots revolt against corporate overreach. In the weeks that followed, the blockade would uncover skeletons Deere had long buried, from exploitative pricing models to deliberate repair lockouts. And the fallout wouldn't be confined to spreadsheets or trade routes. It would land squarely on the dinner tables of North America as supply chains buckled under the strain of a company too rigid to adapt and too arrogant to listen. Up next, we dive into how this confrontation didn't happen overnight. The truth: farmers have been simmering with frustration for over a decade, and John Deere ignored every warning. The seeds of this conflict weren't planted at the border. They were sown in the fields barns, and workshops of America and Mexico over the last 10 years. What looked like a sudden rebellion was, in fact, the explosion of long-suppressed resentment, and it all centered around one word: control. John Deere tractors and combines are known for their durability, efficiency, and cutting-edge technology. But in their pursuit of technological dominance, Deere began locking its machines behind a wall of proprietary software. At first, farmers appreciated the innovation: GPS-guided plowing, advanced diagnostic systems, and autonomous capabilities. But that appreciation quickly soured when breakdowns occurred. Take Sarah Johnson, a fourth-generation corn farmer from Nebraska. One day, her combine triggered a fault code during peak harvest season. The problem? A faulty sensor costing around $50. But Sarah wasn't allowed to simply replace the part and restart her equipment. Her machine's onboard computer had locked her out. To fix the issue, she had to call an authorized John Deere technician, wait 3 days, and pay over $500 just to access the diagnostic screen. The final repair bill, including labor and travel, came close to $2,000. All this for a basic fix she could have handled herself. And then there's Eduardo Vasquez from Sinaloa, Mexico. His story is even more devastating. Eduardo paid in full for a brand new tractor, only to watch it sit motionless just 10 meters across the border. He had land to till, seeds to sow, and no way to get the machine he owned. It wasn't just frustrating, it was catastrophic. By the time the planting window closed, his 5,000-acre farm remained untouched, and Eduardo faced the likelihood of missing his entire growing season. But the most disturbing part of this story wasn't the cost or the delays, it was the helplessness. Again and again, farmers were told the same thing: only a certified John Deere technician could help. And if one wasn't available, too bad. The result? Week-long downtimes, wilting crops, skyrocketing bills, and mounting anger. Farmers began to realize that their ownership was, at best, an illusion. They had bought the machine, but not the ability to fix it. Every subsystem, from engine to GPS, was tied to digital locks. Even if they had the right tools and replacement parts, they couldn't override the software without Deere's permission. For many in rural communities, this felt like betrayal. Farming isn't just a job, it's a way of life. Independence, resilience, and resourcefulness are core to the identity of farmers. And now, they were being told they couldn't repair their own tools, that they had to ask for permission, that they had to pay, again, for something they already owned. In rural Mexico, the consequences were even more severe. Over 300 farm closures were documented between 2016 and 2021, many linked directly to equipment downtime and repair-related losses. One farmer had to tow his equipment over 170 kilometers to reach an authorized service center, only to discover the fix was locked behind a software code he couldn't access. What Deere touted as innovation had for many become a cage. Farmers weren't just angry about pricing or delays. They felt stripped of autonomy, exploited by a company that no longer saw them as partners, but as cash cows. The rage built slowly, hidden behind polite conversations at dealership counters and quiet grumblings in community meetings. But it was there, growing, festering. And all it needed was a spark. That spark came at the border. When tractors were halted under the pretense of inspection, it felt like poetic justice. Deere, for all its market dominance, was suddenly at the mercy of the very people it had disregarded. And when the headlines hit, farmers across the continent didn't flinch. They nodded. What followed wasn't just a protest, it was a reckoning. And it was only getting started. In the next section, we'll uncover how this rebellion didn't just strike the heart of Deere's user base, it tore through Wall Street with a fury no analyst saw coming. A $14 billion market collapse would mark the beginning of the company's unraveling. When news of the Mexican tractor blockade first broke, Wall Street barely flinched. John Deere's stock opened flat that morning, with analysts brushing off the delays as a short-term regulatory issue. But by midday, the tone had shifted. And by the end of the week, Deere's market cap had collapsed by over 27%, wiping more than $14 billion in value. Its worst single-week drop in 185 years of corporate history. The cause? not just delayed shipments. Investors had suddenly realized what farmers had known for years. Deere's business model wasn't built on selling tractors. It was built on controlling them. For years, the company had relied on its monopolistic grip over parts, diagnostics, and software locks to squeeze additional profits from its customer base. Every update, every service call, every repair was routed through Deere's proprietary systems. This control allowed Deere to pad its margins while presenting a facade of technological superiority. But that control had now become its Achilles heel. As hundreds of tractors sat idle at the border, Mexican farmers canceled payments. U.S. farmers demanded alternatives. Warehouses in Saltillo and Monterrey began filling up with unsold equipment, and the parts and service revenues, once a quiet $2 billion profit machine, began drying up. Credit rating agencies moved fast. Moody's placed Deere on a negative watch, citing concentrated market risk and overexposure to proprietary service dependencies. S&P followed, flagging Deere's reliance on regional repair monopolies as structurally vulnerable. Within days, Deere's borrowing costs had surged, and bondholders began pulling out. Internally, panic was spreading. Emergency liquidity projections painted a grim picture. Deere was bleeding over $370 million per week in carrying costs, warranty liabilities, blocked orders, and canceled contracts. Executives scrambled to reassure investors, but the damage was already done. Boardroom slides, once filled with quarterly growth metrics, were now replaced with words like trust crisis, reputational collapse, and repair model reevaluation. Analysts who had once rated Deere as untouchable were forced to rethink their models. The company's tight ecosystem, long heralded as its competitive moat, was now seen as a trap. Dealers were overwhelmed, farmers were furious, and competitors were beginning to circle. The question on everyone's mind was no longer, how bad is the delay, but how deep does this go? Because it wasn't just about tractors stuck at a border. It was about a brand that had built its empire on loyalty and necessity, and suddenly found both unraveling in real time. The market had spoken. Deere's business model, once seen as visionary, was now viewed as predatory. And investors weren't waiting around for a recovery. But if Wall Street was shocked, the heartland was furious. In the next chapter, we'll explore how decades of loyalty died in an instant, and why farmers who once bled green and yellow were now burning their John Deere hats. For decades, the name John Deere wasn't just a brand, it was a badge of honor. In rural America, owning a green and yellow machine meant something. It symbolized legacy, quality, and hard-earned trust passed down through generations. But in 2025, all of that collapsed, and it started with a single invoice. Michael Peterson, a wheat farmer from western Kansas, had been a loyal Deere customer for 30 years. His father drove a Deere, his grandfather did too. But when Michael was charged $500 to clear a fault code that took just 5 minutes to diagnose during harvest season, something inside him broke. It wasn't the money, he said. It was the realization that I didn't own my own farm anymore. Not really. They did. That same week, in Nebraska, the state's largest agricultural cooperative dropped a bombshell. It announced a full suspension of all John Deere purchases. $40 million in planned orders were redirected to Case IH in New Holland. Their statement was blunt: we support companies that support farmers. It didn't stop there. Dozens of co-ops, buying groups, and state-level ag networks followed suit. Social media lit up with angry farmers sharing repair horror stories. Forums once used for crop advice were now packed with guides on switching brands. The phrase "Deere Free by 26" started trending. Then came the American Farm Bureau Federation, the most powerful farming lobby in the country. In a move that stunned political insiders, the Federation issued a scathing rebuke of John Deere. The statement supported the global right-to-repair movement and praised Mexico's resistance as a bold, necessary corrective against monopolistic abuse. For Deere, the response was catastrophic. The company had always counted on rural loyalty. It sponsored rodeos, farming festivals, and even church programs. But now those communities were turning their backs, and they weren't just walking away. They were organizing. Petitions circulated demanding legal reform. Dealers reported an explosion in quote requests for competitors. Some farmers even returned newly purchased Deere equipment and ate the cost just to cut ties. It was a cultural collapse, not just a commercial one. In one particularly viral video, a farmer torched his John Deere cap, declaring, "I'm not your hostage anymore." The symbolism was devastating. Deere had always seen itself as part of the community. But to farmers, the company now looked like an overlord. And just as rural America began to revolt, a new front opened up, one that Deere couldn't control. Because while farmers were cutting ties publicly, others were going underground. And what came next was a digital insurrection. The courtroom was supposed to be the battleground. In early spring, a coalition of 72 farmers in Minnesota filed a class action lawsuit against John Deere, accusing the company of violating antitrust laws through its repair restrictions. The complaint alleged that Deere had created a closed ecosystem, intentionally blocking third-party repair to inflate service costs and monopolize post-sale revenue. The case made headlines, but for many farmers, the legal process moved too slowly, and their anger was boiling too quickly. So they turned to something faster, riskier, and far more explosive: technology. Online communities once used to discuss crop rotation or fertilizer ratios were now flooded with DIY firmware hacks, diagnostic tool bypasses, and cracked software downloads. Membership in unauthorized repair groups surged over 300% in just a few weeks. At the heart of this underground rebellion was a piece of code known only by its pseudonym, Green Ghost. Developed anonymously, Green Ghost allowed farmers to bypass Deere's restrictive software, clear fault codes, and unlock system settings previously accessible only by certified technicians. For many farmers, it was more than a tool. It was a symbol of resistance. "We're not criminals," said one Iowa corn grower. "We're just trying to fix our tractors." And yet, what started as an act of desperation quickly morphed into a full-scale movement. Former Deere technicians began offering unlicensed house calls. Unauthorized parts dealers sprang up, shipping directly to farmers. YouTube channels emerged with step-by-step instructions on bypassing repair locks. And for every takedown Deere issued, 2 more tutorials popped up elsewhere. The rebellion spread globally. From Argentina to Australia, farmers shared the same grievances and the same solutions. In forums, they traded firmware keys like war stories. Green Ghost wasn't just unlocking tractors, it was unlocking frustration pent up for years. And while Deere tried to fight back with cease and desist letters and software updates, they couldn't plug all the leaks. Their once impervious walled garden had been breached permanently. But the biggest blow wasn't coded, it was printed. That's because next came the whistleblowers, internal documents, PowerPoint slides, emails, testimonies, all leaked by disillusioned insiders. And what they revealed made even Deere's critics gasp. Because the truth wasn't just that Deere made repairs difficult, the truth was that they had done it on purpose. The cracks in John Deere's fortress didn't come just from angry farmers or clever hackers. They came from within, and when they did, the company's carefully guarded secrets spilled into the open like fuel on a fire already burning. It began with a Dropbox link posted anonymously on a private online forum used by current and former Deere employees. The link contained 64 pages of internal presentations and email exchanges. The document's title: Revenue Enhancement Through Service Exclusivity. The contents: a strategic blueprint for building profit by systematically locking out third-party repair access and funneling all diagnostics through Deere-certified dealerships. At first, no one could believe it was real. But days later, a man named Thomas Wilson stepped into the spotlight. A former firmware engineer who had worked on Deere's flagship 8R and 9R series tractors, Wilson confirmed the document's authenticity. And his testimony made headlines. "We didn't build for uptime," Wilson said in a televised interview. "We built for margin." He went on to describe how Deere's engineering teams were instructed to design systems that required proprietary software, even for minor repairs. A $60 hydraulic sensor failure?
That was enough to shut down the entire machine until it was cleared through Deere's back end. A loose connection in the fuel module, that too could disable the entire unit until reauthorized. And farmers, they were forced to sit, pay, or watch their crops wither.
More damning were the emails attached to the strategy deck. In one, a senior executive discussed deliberately introducing vague fault codes to drive up dealer service visits. If it fails in May, they'll pay by June, one message read, referencing the high-pressure planting season. Another executive suggested bundling software locks with warranty compliance, forcing farmers to choose between paying more or voiding their coverage. The documents outlined financial projections showing how every 10% increase in repair service capture would net Deere an additional $350 million annually. But perhaps the most disturbing slide was titled simply, "The customer is not the owner." That phrase, cold, corporate, and calculated, became a rallying cry for furious farmers. As the document circulated, Deere scrambled for damage control. Press releases framed the revelations as taken out of context. Spokespeople cited protecting machine integrity and ensuring safety. But the tone had already shifted. No one believed the excuses anymore. What shocked many wasn't just the manipulation, it was the precision. These weren't bugs, they were features. Strategically engineered features designed to turn equipment into recurring revenue.
Wilson wasn't alone. Within a week, 2 more engineers came forward anonymously, sharing screenshots of project briefs and compliance audits. One internal memo listed goals like maximize digital dependencies and reduce third-party repair penetration. Another praised dealerships for strong enforcement of exclusivity agreements. The revelations turned farmers' frustration into fury. They hadn't just been overcharged, they had been targeted, and the betrayal ran deep. Public trust in Deere, already eroding, collapsed. Lawmakers began citing the documents in Senate hearings. Agricultural watchdogs called for antitrust investigations. Even long loyal dealerships began questioning their allegiance. It was no longer just a protest, it was a reckoning. But as farmers processed the manipulation they had endured, an even darker truth emerged. Deere's profit model didn't just exploit breakdowns, it weaponized crises. And what came next would shatter what was left of its public image. The whistleblower revelations triggered a wave of investigations, but none hit harder than the testimonies of Robert Johnson, a former John Deere regional service manager who had spent over 2 decades inside the system. What Johnson disclosed was not only deeply unethical, it was potentially criminal.
He revealed that Deere had implemented something called seasonal elasticity pricing. It was a strategy built around one brutal principle: charge more when farmers are most desperate. During peak harvest and planting seasons, prices for essential parts, transmission sensors, coolant modules, air intakes were quietly tripled. Service fees were increased. And in some cases, availability of certain components was intentionally restricted. "We knew exactly what they could tolerate," Johnson said in an explosive CBS interview. "We ran stress models on farmer cash flows, crop cycles, and borrowing patterns. If the data said they'd pay, we pushed." One internal document labeled Extraction Maximization Matrix showed how service call delays were encouraged when dealers were overbooked, just to increase urgency pricing. If a farmer was already behind schedule due to weather delays, the system flagged them as a priority for high-margin services. And it wasn't just a few bad apples. The directive came from the top. Deere's pricing models were granular. They included forecasts based on regional drought likelihoods, commodity futures, and even trade disruptions. In a slide titled Crisis Capture Opportunities, Deere executives outlined how external shocks like tariffs or storms could be turned into financial windfalls through part markups and deferred service bundles. The system wasn't just exploitative, it was predatory. Johnson's testimony prompted outrage. Within days, state agricultural agencies in Missouri, Iowa, and South Dakota confirmed that dozens of preventable crop losses had occurred over the past 5 years, directly linked to delayed repairs and withheld parts. One farmer, who asked to remain anonymous, described how a $400 coolant sensor that failed mid-harvest couldn't be replaced for 6 days. The delay destroyed over 40 acres of corn. They knew we were stuck, he said, and they squeezed us. Another document leaked by Johnson revealed an internal list of restricted parts, items only available to authorized dealers during crisis periods. These included fuel injectors, hydraulic modules, and cooling systems. The list had one simple instruction: block third-party sales during Tier 1 events. Tier 1 events? That's what Deere called the periods when farmers were most vulnerable, like harvest week or just before spring planting. By this point, the outcry wasn't just from farmers. Consumer advocacy groups got involved. State attorneys general opened formal inquiries, and in Washington, multiple members of Congress demanded an antitrust probe into Deere's service practices. But even as the pressure mounted, another shift was already underway, one that would permanently change the farming equipment market. Deere's competitors weren't just watching, they were preparing, and when the time came, they moved with ruthless precision. While Deere's reputation crumbled, its rivals saw a once-in-a-generation opportunity, and they didn't hesitate. Case IH, Deere's largest North American competitor, was the first to strike. Just 5 days after the whistleblower documents went public, Case launched a bold initiative called Open Farming. Under the program, every farmer who purchased Case machinery was granted full diagnostic access, unrestricted parts ordering, and zero dealer lockouts. "We're not just selling equipment," a Case executive said. "We're restoring freedom." The response was overwhelming. Within 2 weeks, Case reported its highest order volume since 2008. Dealerships in the Midwest extended hours to meet demand. One Iowa dealer said, "We had customers trading in Deere equipment with less than 500 hours on it. That's unheard of." Kubota moved just as quickly. Its Farmer First campaign emphasized transparency, repair freedom, and open source customization. For the first time, farmers could legally download diagnostic software for Kubota machines directly from the company's website. Even Mahindra, the Indian manufacturing giant, jumped in. It pledged to triple its U.S. dealer network within 18 months and rolled out a marketing slogan that hit Deere where it hurt: full ownership, half the cost. And it worked. Sales skyrocketed. Market share shifted. More than 140 John Deere dealerships reportedly entered discussions with competing brands. Within 30 days, 37 had already signed letters of intent to switch. One Minnesota dealer made headlines when he publicly severed ties with Deere after 22 years. "I used to sell freedom," he said. "Now I sell shackles. And I'm done." Farmers embraced these changes not just for practical reasons, but for symbolic ones. They wanted out of a system that made them feel powerless. And Deere's collapse wasn't just a victory for its competitors. It was a vindication for every farmer who had been silenced, sidelined, or squeezed. As Deere fought fires on every front, its rivals kept scaling. They built customer forums, hosted town halls, and released transparency reports. Kubota even began open sourcing software tools to third-party developers, inviting them to build custom applications for soil management, weather tracking, and automated crop monitoring. A revolution was underway. But just as competitors solidified their gains, a deeper crisis emerged, one that transcended profit margins, brand loyalty, or market share. Because while tractors idled at the border, the real casualty was about to surface: the food supply chain. What began as a silent blockade turned into a movement, a rebellion, a reckoning. For decades, John Deere was more than a brand. It was a symbol of progress, of reliability, of American farming pride. But when the people it served became the ones it silenced, that symbol cracked. And what spilled out was a story of control disguised as innovation and profit masquerading as partnership. This wasn't just about tractors or repair bills. It was about ownership, autonomy, the right to fix what you own, the right to survive without asking permission. Farmers from Kansas to Sinaloa stood up not because they wanted to disrupt the system, but because the system had stopped working for them. And when corporations forgot who they were built to serve, the people served them a reminder. The fallout is far from over. Supply chains are still reeling. Markets are still adjusting. And around the world, other nations are watching closely. Because what happened at the border wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of a new kind of independence. And this time, it's not about horsepower. It's about power, real power, returning to the hands that feed the world. Once again, thanks for watching this video. If you got something out of this, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. And hey, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Agree, disagree, or something in between. I'd love to hear it.